So here at Go for Growth, we asked a number of public sector organisations what they thought the top things were that providers can often, through no intent and certainly no lack of effort or skill, but potentially get wrong. And so these were the top 10 items really that came back, and we wanted to run through them today just to bring them to your attention. Some of them sound so obvious when we talk through them together, but having both bid myself, I know that I've fallen foul of them myself as a provider, and as an evaluator in procurement, I have seen it happen, all of these before, and so I think it's worth just running through it. So not answering the question just obviously feels really self-explanatory. However, when you're reading the question in conjunction with the specification, answer the question not what you think they want, because ultimately that can result in lower scores. So if it says something like, how do you embed something? How can you evidence X, Y, or Z? Then make sure that you do all of those things. If it's talking about your values, then you need to talk about how you embed your values, not necessarily talk about how you might put together policies that might reflect those values. It's about really getting into the ribs of the question and answering it accordingly, and especially with that specification in mind. Submitting all of the documentation, again, just feels really obvious. However, it can often be a place where things do get missed. So that can manifest itself in two ways. For example, a question might ask for a specific piece of evidence like a risk register, and there might be narrative around a risk register, but no actual risk register provided itself. So if the question is asking for examples of documentation, do include it. And standard forms that you need to fill out. So generally in a public sector procurement, you'll be asked to fill out a form of tender. You'll be asked to complete a form around Freedom of Information Act, etc. Make sure that you've gone through the checklist, which is usually on an ITT, to make sure you've submitted all of the documents and the evidential documents that you want to provide with your submission. And caveating is really, it's quite a regular occurrence, and it is generally always difficult for a contracting authority and for an evaluator especially. Bids received with caveats about what the bidder will or will not do for a price is really tough and can often result in lower scores. It puts the contracting authority and the evaluator in a really difficult position. In effect, evaluators, what they're trying to do is understand your direct answer to the question, and that will be married up to the price that you've submitted. And so if you were saying, for example, we can do X, but only if Y is in place, that would be really tough to score. So try and avoid caveating unless it's really, really necessary and makes sense. But generally speaking, avoid caveating. The specification match, it can be a challenge sometimes for contracting authorities. What they really want to make sure is that the proposal that is put forward relates to the requirements of the specification. So the winning bidder or bidders, depending on how many will be awarded, must be able to deliver what's in the specification, and your bid submission will be the how of that. So what you write down in terms of how you do that will be contractualized. So you'll be held to account for the specification and what you've written down in terms of your tender submission, in terms of how you would do that in relation to the questions that you're asked. In terms of reusing previous bids, I am a big fan personally actually of reutilising materials. We don't want to reinvent wheels, and the public sector is already fairly admin heavy, both for procurement and for providers. However, it does come with a health warning. If you are reusing previous bids or responses from previous opportunities, make sure you've assessed the relevance to this particular specification, and make sure that you remove any references to other clients or other bids. Make sure that it is super relevant and proportionate to this particular opportunity. But you may reuse case studies, that kind of thing, where they are a good piece of evidence that can be used in multiple opportunities. That lack of evidence really affects that point number 2. If you're asked for evidence, definitely submit it. And depending on the instructions of the opportunity about whether you can submit separate documents as optional evidence, my view would always be if you can show the contracting authority how you can deliver the services, then you should do so. That's certainly my personal preference, both as a provider and as an evaluator. But do always make sure that you are following the instructions on what you can and can't submit through the particular opportunity. And I talk about awareness of word and page count all of the time. There's so many bids that I've seen where a paragraph has been missed out because it's gone over a word count, or somebody has submitted 3 pages of documentation when it should have been 2. If there is a page count, there is likely to be a standard font that you would need to use. That might be Arial 11, for example. If you are required to use a particular font and size of font, use it, because actually in the checks that could happen when your bid is submitted, you could be found to be non-compliant, and one of 2 things would happen. Your bid may be rejected if it's non-compliant, or it would only be acceptable where the page count cuts off if Arial 11 were used, for example. So in other words, it's never good to go over word or page counts or ignore any of those instructions in there. And in terms of assumptions, never ever assume that evaluators can use information that you haven't written down. So don't assume that they know you, don't assume that they know that you've done some great work somewhere and so that they will score you on it. Any evaluator can only ever score what is written down. And generally speaking, the evaluation process, there will be multiple evaluators per bid, and they will be done independently of each other, and there would usually be a moderation process to reach consensus. At all points, both evaluators and moderators can only take into account what you have put in your submission. Anything else they know won't be used. And don't assume they know what acronyms mean, for example, or that technical terms are known by evaluators. So if you are using an acronym, at least the first time you use it, spell it out and put the acronym next to it in brackets so that the evaluator does know. And if you're using overtly technical terms, so in procurement we would use ITT, the invitation to tender. If we were writing that down in a bid submission response, we would spell that out and explain what an ITT is. So just be aware of the words, language and acronyms that you're using, and don't assume that an evaluator will understand those things. And often SQ compliance can be challenging if you are not meeting or you're not understanding what the selection questionnaire, and that's those threshold questions that we talked about, those gateway questions. If you're not meeting those minimum standards, so if you don't have the accreditation or licenses that you need, the policies in place, procedures, insurances, etc. What you should look out for though on compliance and on gateway questions or threshold questions, the selection questionnaire stuff, is that you won't necessarily need everything at the point that you're submitting your bid. Often the authority will ask you to commit to having whatever it is that you need if you were successful by contract implementation date. So if, for example, you were being asked to have Cyber Essentials or Cyber Essentials Plus accreditation, usually you wouldn't necessarily need that for the point that you're bidding. You may, however, need that to be able to actually start delivering the service. But those things are always clear in the ITT, so do make sure you read those things in detail.